As you now gather, I'm Susan Lederman and have lived in New Jersey for the last 55 years. When I was very young, I lived in Czechoslovakia, a country that has now been separated into two, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. I was born in 1937 to I'm an only child. My parents had gotten married in 1933 and were very eager to have children, but I did not manage to arrive till 1937, which was still a pretty quiet time in Czechoslovakia. Next door, in Austria, there were already rumblings of pro-Nazi groups, and of course in Germany, Hitler had taken over. So Jews, even in calm Czechoslovakia, which had a democratic government and opportunities for Jews, Jews were nervous. There were something like 138,000 Jews living in the part of the country from which I came, which was Slovakia. My parents had family in the United States, were not yet thinking seriously about leaving, but their thoughts were more about checking out what the opportunities would be. And it was very, very hard to get visas to come to the United States. From Czechoslovakia per se, or from Slovakia particularly, it would have taken years to get on the quota of people coming. In 1938, there was an agreement called the Munich Agreement, which dismembered Czechoslovakia. The country was split up. Part of it ended up being the Czech Republic. A good part of the Czech Republic was taken by Germany because there were a lot of Germans living in that area. They argued that these people would only have the rights to self-actualization if they were part of Germany. That meant most of the natural borders of this country became Germany. And Slovakia became a Nazi puppet state, which meant that they had government which paid attention to Hitler, but it was not directly occupied by German soldiers or under direct control of Germany. That did not stop this new government of Slovakia of instituting various anti-Jewish laws. Now, keep in mind, I was very little then. I have very fragmented memories of those years, and some of this I had been told later by my parents. But I do remember that I had a woman whose ancestry was German as a baby nurse, and so my first language was German, and which is not unusual again in where I lived in Bratislava, which is just 40 miles away from Vienna. Many people spoke both German, Hungarian, which was because it had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Hungary had controlled it, and Slovak. My first language was German. My parents often spoke Hungarian to one another. Of course, they spoke Slovak as well, but their background was such that they were comfortable in all those languages, and they spoke some English. The story I had been told is when they were courting in the earlier 30s, they spoke English to one another on the telephone because in those days, operators had direct contact with whoever wanted to make a phone call and would listen in. So to have privacy, they spoke English. In any case, my beloved Lala, my nanny, had to leave. She was not Jewish, and one of the decrees that were early adopted, pattern of the Nuremberg laws in Germany, was that Jews could not employ anyone who was not Jewish. Secondly, Jews had to give up many of their luxuries, which would have included telephones and furs and silver and jewelry, whatever. And one of the things that I remember is that I had a very nice fur coat made out of white bunny rabbit fur. And I loved it, and that had to be given up. Furthermore, Jews couldn't just occupy a big house. We had a fairly big house. Two other Jewish families were moved into our house, and I remember tables and chairs sort of being shoved around and furniture stacked so that there'd be room for their belongings as well. Other than that, I don't have, I perhaps sensed that there was a lot of nervousness and unease. I had different baby nurses or nannies afterwards that were Jewish, and unfortunately each of those young women was deported at some point. In Slovakia, deportations initially were supposedly for work, so it was able-bodied people. And if you were working in something that was considered important to the state, either in agriculture or in the case of my father, who owned a printing shop and was able to run it, and it was an important source of printing for the community, we were able to get exemptions. Now, Slovakia was run by a Catholic priest. He was a Nazi, but some of the church influence in policies was demonstrated by making it possible for the whole family of someone who was exempted from deportation to remain, because the church believed in keeping families together. So if you deport them, deport the whole family. If you don't deport them, keep the family together. So my mother and I were secure in a sense when there were some deportations in the early 1940s not to be deported. In 1943, because there was some intervention, I believe, by the Vatican, deportations of Jews temporarily stopped. Still, conditions for Jews were terrible, and there had been many, of course, deported, and you never knew when things would start again. So my parents decided to try to do something else to protect me. My parents, my mother's parents lived in a town called Trnava, which was about an hour's train ride away from Bratislava. And I don't know how, but we were able to visit quite frequently. And the seamstress of my grandparents, my grandmother, lived on the same street they did, a little further down, and she was a very warm and loving woman. In any case, I remember her coming to pick me up from the backyard of my grandparents' house. I had been playing with, I guess, other neighborhood children and was in rompers. And I remember she changed me into a dress, and I think I must have been about 5 years old. So think of it as being perhaps 1942, 43. And she took me to a very imposing church, big, white, tall, spired church. And we went in, and there was a red banquette, sort of, on which you could kneel, which she directed me to do. And a very tall minister to me, black-robed, pointed white collar, came. And that's when I was baptized. I was baptized Lutheran, which was a minority religion in Slovakia, but the religion of the seamstress. And I don't know whether my baptismal certificate was predated or what was done, but I was able to start school, regular public school, in 1943, which I couldn't have done had I been considered Jewish at that time. So I started school, and my parents were still, of course, very, very nervous about where it would be safer for me to be. My mother had a lot of family living in Budapest, Hungary, and it seemed as if Jews in Hungary were safer. The government was not deporting Jews at that time. And somehow my father got permission to take me, again on a train, to Budapest, crossing borders. I don't know how that was done, but we did it. En route, we stopped to visit my parents, my father's family in eastern Slovakia, and his sister and her family in Košice, which had been part of Czechoslovakia, but was part of the Czechoslovakia that was ceded to Hungary as part of the Munich Agreement. So that was already Hungary. And I remember visiting them, and I then remember being in Hungary. I learned Hungarian not too well, but I guess my parents had been practicing with me. And I do remember walking with my mother and finding it an interesting game to be able to try to say things in Hungarian that I would generally say either in German or in Slovak. So we practiced Hungarian. So by the time I got there, my Hungarian was okay, and I could stay with my family. Excuse me. My mother had a sister who had married a Hungarian Jew, and she was living in a hotel in Budapest, part of which had been bombed out, but the rest of it was still quite gracious. So I remember visiting with my father and staying with Aunt Lily and meeting some of the family, my mother's family in Hungary. And somehow my father decided to change his mind and not leave me there with him.
So was he staying with you at that time?
At the hotel?
At the hotel.
I believe so.
And what was it like to see bombed out buildings? Was that frightening, or did you understand that there was war?
I certainly did understand that there was war, because by then we had drills in school, what to do in case there were bombs. And I don't know whether Bratislava was bombed as early as 1943, but we were on the run of Allied bombings, and it certainly was later on in 1944. There was quite a lot of bombing, and so I knew about shelters and the concern of bombing. But in any case, we left and came back to Bratislava. I did not stay in Hungary, which was a good thing, because subsequently Hungarians also started deporting Jews, and actually many Hungarians escaped to Slovakia as a way of trying to get away, including my Aunt Lily, my mother's oldest sister, with whom I was to have stayed. She did come back. By the end of the school year of 1943, it was time, my parents felt, to be in hiding, not even with the exemptions from deportation. Deportations, I think, were starting slowly again. And what they did is they got Pani Jagoshova, the woman who was the seamstress, and her family to take me in and live in a little village outside of Trnava. So I was surprised afterwards when we visited Czechoslovakia in 1990, how close this village really was to where my grandparents had lived. But it was a very simple village. People grew tobacco and various other goods. And the Jagosh family rented a little house for the summer, I suppose, or just rented it. It was maybe a 2 or 3 room house. I remember my bed was on top of a crate where some straw and some quilts were put. The floor was a dirt floor. I used to be a very picky eater when I was a little child. Nobody paid attention to whether I ate or not, so I all of a sudden discovered that eating was a good thing and was not so picky. And I do remember drinking milk that was fresh from the cows, that was warm still and bubbly. So anyhow, I lived like a village child, and that would have been fine, except that summer there was a partisan uprising in Slovakia in a place called Banská Bystrica. And so Germans actually came. The German soldiers were now in this puppet state. It was no longer our homegrown Nazis who were running things, but Germany. And some German soldiers came through the village and I guess were asking directions. And I was the only village child who spoke German, so I gave them directions. And as a result, the villagers started getting nervous as to who I was and what my background was. And so I had to leave there. And I remember being back in the Yagush family house, the seamstress's house and her family's, and there was discussion as to what to do with me next, how to protect me. And my mother hadn't seen me for a long time. My parents, in the meantime, were in hiding. At that time, they were hiding in a bombed-out factory in Bratislava, sort of a makeshift shelter. And so they smuggled me back to Bratislava so I could have a reunion with my mother. And I remember begging my mother to let me stay with them. Mm-hmm. And I really, as children can do, did a big scene about how I wanted to be with my mother. If something happened, we'd be together. But my parents felt this, they wanted more safety for me. What they found was another family to take me in Bratislava, in my hometown. And the way they found them is that my mother had an aunt, a younger aunt, just maybe a decade older than my mother, who with her husband had been rounded up among the people who were they now deporting, and they were going through sort of a farmer's market on the way to the train, the whole group of Jews who were being deported and taken to the train station. And my aunt, who was a spunky woman, thought it'd be worth trying to sneak into the crowds in the farmer's market, and she asked her husband to come with her. He would not, but she did, and she escaped. And what they had done, my aunt, great aunt Cornell, was to have prepared another hiding place for them, but they hadn't gotten there yet before they had been rounded up. And that hiding place was with a Hungarian family, a man and his wife, last name was Paul, who had no children, but they had a spare room, and they were willing to rent that room to my aunt and her husband, my great aunt and her husband. But now that was sort of their first plan A. My great aunt suggested that maybe they would be willing to take me in instead, and so she took me by hand, and we walked to this family, to where Anna and Michael Paul lived, and they looked at me, and I had blondish hair and I had blue eyes, and they decided to risk it, and so I lived with them till the end of the war. That's where I was then in hiding.
By yourself, without your
family, just by myself, and I had an assumed name. We had papers that, so my name in Slovak would have been Zuzana, or Zuzka as a diminutive, Sturz, which was considered Sturzova, which was considered more of a German name, and therefore possibly Jewish. And so instead of Zuzka Sturzova, I was Zuzka Sulova. And Mrs. Paul tested me several times. She'd wake me up in the middle of the night to make sure I gave the right name, the assumed name. They lived in an apartment house. There were some German soldiers billeted in the apartment house. I had to pretend that I could not understand what they were talking about, because that again would have been a possible giveaway. And we were bombed. The house next door actually was hit by a bomb, so there were many times that we spent in the basement, when there was an air raid. I got to walk their dog, so I would go outside, and I remember once feeling very threatened by this huge German who was walking in the other direction, but nothing happened. I played with children next door, and I had to pretend the very few times on very dark, moonless nights where my parents visited, they may have visited once or twice during that period, to not know who they were when they came. If there was anyone else around who then would have wondered about my story, because my story, the official story, was that I was the niece of the Pals, that I came from a different part of the country where there had been some fighting and was sent for safekeeping to be with them. Moved there probably in October 1944, and we were liberated on, I believe, April 5th or so of 1945 by the Soviet Army.
Can I just ask you what that was like? I mean, you obviously, we know as adults that these were heroic and courageous people who took you in, were willing to protect you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering from your standpoint how it was, how you felt, how you dealt with the separation.
Well, separation was difficult, but I didn't have a choice. I didn't know what terrible things would befall me if I was caught, but it was certainly not going to be a good thing. And so scary. They were not only kind, but bright people. I learned, they homeschooled me. That I would have been in second grade, so I learned multiplication tables in Hungarian, which is perhaps the only thing that I still know in Hungarian. But it just did that.
And you had a resiliency in you that enabled you at such a young, vulnerable age to adjust.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, I think it is amazing what people can do if they have to.
Mm-hmm.
And in any case, reunited with my parents. Day after fighting stopped in a very strange way, in the sense that I could never quite get a good explanation of this. My parents ended up not living in this home, in this bombed out factory much longer than, after I had left. My mother and this aunt managed to rent a room from a man whose family he had sent his family to the country. Again, he was concerned about bombing. He had a job, so he sent his family to the country. He would go on the weekends to visit them. And my aunt and my mother were renting as sort of two unmarried women in this room. My father lived in that room all the time. The owner of this apartment, or the one, principal renter of this apartment, never knew that. He did not know while they lived there, nor did they tell him afterwards. I don't know why, but they didn't. And the only time he met my father's once, my father went into the shelter of that apartment house when the Russians were already coming through. And the story he gave was that he had been living somewhere else and he just came to be together with his wife. But this man, the man who owned the apartment, was the one who crossed the town with still perhaps pockets of fighting going on, or at least cleanup, and came to the Pals. I guess he got some sort of a story that there was, we have a child at the other end of the town, and he came to get me. He must have had some sort of letter from my parents. I have no idea, but I went with him across town to be reunited with my mother.
So you were saying that you were being taken by this gentleman back to your parents, to reunite with your parents.
Right. And, which was, I don't remember the instant when it happened, but I remember being very, very happy to be with my parents. And the only image I have of that walk, if you will, is that somehow en route we came across a huge sack of sugar. And there were Russian soldiers around, whatever, and this man, whose name I have no clue about, I don't remember, decided maybe he should give the sack of sugar to the Russian, who handed him a big stack of who knows what kind of currency. But that's the only memory I have of the actual trip across town, which would have to have been on foot, and it seemed like a long period. But indeed, there I was, if you will, hiding in plain sight in my hometown, the town in which I was born, for the largest part of my time in hiding.
Yeah.
So, and after the war, we could not move back to the house that we had owned, because one of the things that had happened Jews weren't allowed to own property or own businesses. So they had to be Aryanized, meaning that German or someone who was considered, a reliable Christian on the Nazi side could acquire it for essentially no money. Once the war was over, doesn't mean that the original owner got it back, or there had to be actually a court case that took a couple of years to resolve for my father to get his business back. And in the meantime, we also couldn't move back into our house, which was attached to this printing plant, and we ended up in an apartment. The apartment, was a comfortable apartment, but obviously much smaller than the house had been, and we had very little of our own furniture left. One of the things we were able to get is the piano that had been in my grandparents' house in Teneba. My grandparents both perished during the Holocaust, and their apartment had, their house had been very nicely furnished. So, but somehow, the piano made it, and I still have the piano.
Oh, you do.
And that's one thing we were able then to ship when we came to the United States. Now, we did not leave Czechoslovakia till 1948, we left Czechoslovakia by September 1948. There was, Czechoslovakia had been a democracy. After the war, it looked promising, and there was a coup d'etat in February 1948 where the communists took over.
Right.
And I think my parents did not want to stay under yet one more totalitarian regime. And we were able to get visas to come to Canada, not to the United States, because those long lines still existed. And even though my father had two uncles living in the United States who owned taverns in Bayonne, New Jersey, and two brothers, one of whom had been with the Czechoslovak government in exile, and was at the start was working at the International Monetary Fund, and another brother who also lived in Bayonne, and some cousins and whatever. Again, we had visas to Canada. We were able to stay in the United States. We came through the United States to visit them. We came in 1948. We had a very interesting voyage in November 1948. Leaving Rotterdam, ship then went to Hamburg, and across was a small freighter with 11 passengers. Of the 11 passengers, there were the three of us, my parents and I, my father's sister and husband and their one child, who also had survived, and then another family of 5 people who I think were attached somehow to the U.S. military. So we all ate at the captain's table. That was the only table on board. And we arrived in the United States the day after President Truman had been elected on his own as president in November 1948.
So even though you only had visas to Canada, you came through the States. Were you able to stay then, or what happened?
Well, we were able to come to the States on a visiting visa and tried to apply to be able to stay, including, actually there was even a bill going through Congress. There was a bill introduced by, I think it was Senator Kilgore of Iowa, to let us stay as sort of a family reunification. But that bill, may have been filed, but I don't believe it was ever acted on. In the interim, the United States had adopted the Displaced Persons Act, and we qualified as refugees from a communist country, to stay here.
And so you were able to stay.
Yes.
And
we lived first 6 weeks in Bayonne, where we had family, And I started school there. I had a cousin about my age, and she and her friends helped me with my accent. I had had some English lessons before I came. I had, besides that, Hungarian, German, and Slovak, very unrelated languages. I also had to take some Russian in school, still in Slovakia, Czechoslovakia at the time. And I had some private English lessons. And so learning English was not so difficult. Pronunciation perhaps was, but as I said, my cousin and her friends worked with me till I got the TH sound right and the V and W sounds distinguished. And that's when it goes.
And how was it for you coming to the States? Did you feel accepted? Did you feel at home? What was that
I don't
like
think I
for you?
really felt at home. I mean, again, it was nice to have some family around, and things were perhaps strange, both in what clothing an 11-year-old wears. I had skipped a grade in Czechoslovakia, so by grade I should have gone into 7th grade, but I was a very young 7th grader, as it is. So I'm sure it's not an easy time to be that age anyhow.
Right.
So of course I made friends over time. I was asked at times, did you talk about your past? No, I didn't. I mean, most my friends may have known I was born somewhere else, and they met my parents who had accents that may have been clear. But till Anne Frank's diary was published, I don't think I ever mentioned any of this to any friends of mine, and if I did, even afterwards, it would be fairly limited.
So it wasn't until they began to learn about a child of the Holocaust that then your story also came out, or you shared it.
Right.
And so you were in New Jersey still, or
well, we were in New Jersey, as I said, short time, and then moved to first Woodside, Queens, for probably a year. During that time is when I guess our status got established, because we were able to pack a whole, what was called a lift, a big crate full of stuff, limited certain ways, but some furniture, some linens, that sort of thing. And that was all in storage in Europe till we had a permanent address. And that eventually caught up with us. My parents rented an apartment in Forest Hills. Lived there.
And finished school
there? I finished junior high and first, and then went to Forest Hills High School. And probably what was more traumatic in terms of growing up, when I was 16 and between my junior and senior year in high school, my mother died very suddenly. She had an aneurysm and died, and so that was a very traumatic,
I'm sure,
period. So what was extraordinary is that my father, who sort of looked upon his own childhood as sort of a lesson as to what to do, had the courage and confidence to let me go away to school. His friends had urged him, Susie can stay, I can go to Queens College and take care of him, whatever. And he, even though money was tight, made it possible for me to really become American, if you will, in a big way, go to the Midwest to go to university. And I think that was pivotal.
So can you just speak about that a little bit? In what ways?
I think it really was an effective break between sort of what had shaped my life till then to just being involved in campus life and new friends. I do know that in my freshman year, I still was perhaps dreaming in Slovak. Must have been doing more translation. Why do I think that? Because I distinctly remember waking up one morning and talking Slovak to my roommate, who sort of looked at me like, what? And that went away. So, then the sort of taking on the mantle of being an American was fully complete. And I had to wait till I was over 16. No, I had to wait till I was over 18 to become a citizen, because my father became a citizen after I was 16, and then I had to become a citizen after my freshman year, so I was 18. And by then I had, taken courses in political science and whatever, and, the whole citizenship exam was kind of a joke, because I knew certainly as much as anyone else who could ask.
And just if you would speak about your further education and your career path.
Well, for one, I initially thought I'd major in political science and focus on international relations, that sort of thing. But then met my husband in my sophomore year in college, and he had been already served in the Army. He was in graduate school, and we got married before my senior year, and we were going to live in Ann Arbor, Michigan until he got his PhD, and there was not much I was going to do with international relations in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So I got a teaching certificate and was able to teach, and I taught American government and whatever. And when we came and lived in New Jersey, eventually I decided, well, teaching is pretty good. Maybe I ought to see that I could get qualified to be a teacher here. But I didn't want to get a master's in education. I thought those were not very interesting courses, and I took a master's in political science at Rutgers, and they were starting to talk about PhD right away. So I decided, well, I might as well try, and as long as they'll pay for it, then I got a graduate assistantship. Mm-hmm. So I went to get my master's and my PhD after our daughter, the younger one, the younger child, started kindergarten. We put her in an all-day kindergarten. I took classes when she was in school, and inevitably went on and got my PhD, taught political science and public administration for 35 years at Kean University, and became very civically active, particularly in the League of Women Voters. Was president of the League of Women Voters of the United States from 1990 to 92, active prior to that and after the various civic organizations like Common Cause and in New Jersey, New Jersey Future, Regional Plan Association, other groups like that, to shape what goes on in our lives. I feel very strongly, and I think this is something that was certainly inspired by my parents as well, that we owe to future generations to care about what is going on in our civic life, in our government, in our economic life, and that it can't be just a selfish, inward kind of experience, that we have to care about people around us, and those perhaps who are not even within our sight, but whose lives depend on our actions.